to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. We're really excited today to be joined by Dr. Elin Haf Davies, who is founder and CEO of Apartito, a really exciting technology company. Hi, Elin Haf.
Hi, thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Great for you to join us on the show. And we're going to get to know you and get to learn lots about Apartito as we get into the podcast, Elin Haf. But what we really want to zoom in on at the start of the podcast is the topic in mind for this particular episode. And that's all about paediatric clinical trials and designing clinical trials, especially with paediatric patients in mind, because I know that this is a topic that's quite close to your heart. So to kick us off then, could you just describe to us how paediatric clinical trials differ from trials that are conducted in adults?
Yeah, so as you said, this is a topic that's very much close to my heart and driven really by my clinical experience of supporting children through clinical trials. Back when I did my first ever clinical trial, it was still very much of the mindset that, we shouldn't allow children to be guinea pigs and, it wasn't ethical that children were recruited in clinical trials. And thankfully, the mindset and the culture has shifted that we should be protecting children through clinical trials and not protecting children from clinical trials. But of course, there's a massive difference in the implications of clinical trials and the health of the child physically and emotionally before they take part in clinical trials. And a standard line you always hear is, children are not small adults. And I think that prevails across all of the aspects. So first and foremost, when you think of the medicine that's being administered, children don't like to swallow tablets. They don't like bitter taste. They don't want to sit for a 4-hour infusion. So there are aspects to consider when it comes to the administration of the medicine. But for me, when it comes to overall study design, the critical part is the assessments, the tests, the endpoints, the outcomes that's being considered. And so many clinical trials in children, unfortunately, from my point of view, are using endpoints that were developed initially for adults and then sort of applied to children, which means that they're not age appropriate, disease specific, or really measuring what's important to children. And on top of that, you put children through all these painful tests and assessments, and you're not really, in my view, guaranteed to get an outcome or a data set that's meaningful to children in their typically growing age. So an age-appropriate, disease-specific endpoint, which means it's fast, it's passive, it's pain-free. That's the dream outcome for a clinical trial designed for children, in my view.
No, it's fascinating. Can you give us any examples of like that kind of mismatch in terms of assessments and what the impact is on the actual pediatric patient in mind that might be involved in a trial of being exposed to something that might not necessarily kind of jive with somebody of that age?
Yeah, I mean, the classic one, which I'm sure most of the people would be aware of, is the 6-minute walk test, right? And if you think of the 6-minute walk test, this was an assessment developed for adults with cardiorespiratory health issues, but have since sort of permeated into every single aspect of clinical trials, including children. And then if you look at a child's development in terms of walking ability from, when they become sort of, walking at sort of 2 to 3 years old up to adulthood, the gait parameters and the way we walk change considerably from around 2 to around 10, 11 years old. And then between sort of 12 and 14, it becomes a bit more adult-like. So looking at how far you walk when in a 6-minute distance is a really interesting aspect when you've got a growing, developing child in one aspect. The second piece, which is, I think, more importantly, is 6 minutes is a really long time in a child's attention span. And that goes for any child, right? If you think of a 5-year-old that's typically developing, but then if you give them steroids for treatment, or if they've got behavioral issue, if they've got autism and they are overstimulated with noise in a hospital corridor or lights from a flashing strobing lights in a hospital corridor, and yet you're still asking them to concentrate on a task of walking for 6 minutes. The data, the implication is really profound. And we know now that if you take them away from school on a day they're missing their most favorite pudding for lunch, or if you bribe them with money or ice cream, they can walk more or less depending on what kind of, grabs their fancy on that day. So, it's just one example where it's an endpoint developed for an adult disease, validated in an adult population, and yet come to pretty much anything to do with ambulation in a pediatric population. And there are others. I guess just to finish off, there was the one that stands in my mind the most was my first ever clinical trial supporting children with a neuronopathic Gaucher disease. And they have saccade initiation failure, which a lot of children end up blinking or head thrusting to sort of correct. And the clinical trial were using the saccades as a primary endpoint, but in some instances required a coil to be attached to the eyeball of the eye, the eyeball of the patient, to sort of track the lights across a screen, and requiring about an hour and a half of concentration with a coil in the eye. I mean, who thought that was an appropriate thing for children is beyond me. And funnily enough, we ended up with inconclusive data at the end of a 2-year study. So pretty traumatic issues, actually.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And while you were talking, I was thinking about my 3-year-old and 1-year-old, and like whether they would have tolerated either the 6-minute walk test or that other procedure with the coil on the eye that you talked about, and definitely not. So I could see it.
And just to sort of kind of close on the point, I guess, the end result is you don't know whether the total amount of distance they walked was due to their physical ability or to their concentration span and other things that was sort of happening, really, which is pretty important differentiation to make.
No, definitely. So to backtrack a little bit then, was there a scenario when no clinical trials were really being undertaken on pediatric patients? And then if I've heard correctly in terms of what you've described so far, what's happened is people have just tried to shoehorn normal adult-based clinical trials and how those are conducted into a pediatric setting and expected that to work.
Yeah, so I think historically, pharmaceutical companies just avoided clinical trials in pediatrics as much as possible. The FDA did have sort of what we call an incentive to make it appealing to them. But in 2007, the EMA brought the pediatric regulation that mandated that pharmaceutical companies considered the needs of children during their drug development. And I think this is a really important aspect to understand the sort of spirit of why this regulation came into force. Because the problem was that pharmaceutical companies were getting medicines on the market, they were becoming licensed within SPC or an indication of 18 and above. But then you had pediatricians around the world going, okay, well, this child is about half the weight of an adult, so I'll give half the dose that's been licensed by the regulators. And as we know from renal maturation, brain maturation, sometimes you need a higher allometric scaling of the drug, sometimes you need lower, and all that kind of thing. And so we needed to get the PK/PD dosing through clinical trials to look at safety, but also efficacy in these. So the regulatory pediatric regulation in 2007 was really important in that regard. So it's not to say that they weren't experiences of doing clinical trials in children, before, but this forced the agenda really forward. And the FDA have just launched a guidance of how to consider the needs of children in pediatric clinical trials last month, which is really exciting to see. I think what's still lacking, so the mindset is there now, the regulatory framework is there now. I think from my view, what's missing is the tools. And what I mean by that is the tools to make child-friendly clinical trials. And, my wish list would be that we switch this on its head now and say, instead of thinking of adults first and then shoehorning things to children, whether it be the endpoints, the trials, the medicines, whatever, let's start with children and say, do you know what? Most adults would benefit from doing things that are easy and tasty and passive and friendly as children would, because actually, why wouldn't we want to make life as easy? So let's start developing these tools for children and then roll them out for adults, and not let's develop these for adults and then shoehorn them to children.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, actually. And I guess it touches upon so many different facets of the clinical trial, right? So everything from, consent, for example. I don't know. I've seen a few consent forms in my time, and I would, even as a grown adult, they're pretty sterile, and they use complex language and they can be difficult to interpret. So something like that in a pediatric trial surely has lots of scope for disruption and making it more child friendly, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. When we look at, and maybe this is a British thing, and I'm not saying it's but the average Daily Mail reader is perceived to have a reading age of an 8-year-old. And, I think there's a lot of adults out there that don't necessarily have the literacy skills that we assume them to have. And yet they're the exact people that we ask to read a 25-page text-heavy information sheet to take part in a clinical trial. And as you say, there's a disconnect there. People today absorb their information via videos on TikToks or graphics on Facebook or images on Instagram. And so the world of conveying really detailed, complex information in a 30-page Word document, I think is well and truly a gone by era. And this is where, if we can make them understandable for children, adults would benefit in equal measures.
Definitely. And you talked a fair bit already about some of the endpoints, and they all seem to be on the digital side of things. Could you talk to us about some better solutions versus what you described before, like the 6-minute walk test, and maybe some more child-friendly type solutions that can support these endpoints?
Yeah, where we're sort of, putting a lot of effort from Aparito's point of view is thinking what's passive, what's easy to capture. And, that's moving away from paper-based questionnaires as one example, which still prevails, or to very long passive tests that require concentration, active tests that require concentration and aspects. So where we're landing at the moment is video-based analytics and wearables. So wearables has a huge amount of value add in terms of the data captures passive and you go about your everyday life. But operationally, they still bring some challenges in that regard. From a wearable point of view, I think the greatest success is in the Duchenne muscular dystrophy world, where the European Medicine Agency qualified 95% stride velocity from a wearable measuring free living in the home environment against the 6-minute walk test, and demonstrated more sensitivity. So the young person goes around their daily life wearing the wearable, and then we look at their stride velocity instead of the 6-minute walk test. From where we're looking at is video-based assessment of tasks in the home.
Okay.
Either clinical assessments such as the SARA scale, the Severity Ataxia Rating Scale that becomes SARA Home. So they get to do them in a familiar environment without the stress of traveling to clinic or the fatigue of traveling to clinic. And so you get, a more regular kind of natural recording, but also activities of daily living, so self-care, eating, and these videos then having the ability to have the standard central assessor, but also some pose estimation, machine learning algorithms to look at symmetry of movement, intensity of movement, and things like that.
That's cool. And when people hear things like video assessment, they probably think that's easy, right? But my experience of working in this space is that nothing is easy because it's very heavily regulated and we're dealing with human beings as well. Can you talk to us about some of the, operational considerations that you alluded to, both for wearables, but also for these video type assessments too, and maybe how you guys are overcoming those at Apartito?
Yeah, so I think if we start with the wearables, I think there's a sort of misconception that it's a one size fits all. And unfortunately, that's very much not the case. And I think what's important is that we don't really go on a fishing expedition too much. So that's where the stride velocity is a really important aspect, so that it's the data endpoint that's kind of considered the important thing, not the hardware wearable that captures it as such, because especially from children, young people, we learned very early on when we gave them big, ugly wearables. They're like, I'm not wearing that to school. Thank you very much. I want an iPhone watch kind of aspect. So you've got to consider things like the size of the wrists, how it looks, how it feels, the battery life. And then when you're running global studies, the import of these wearables into some countries can be a real problem. On top of that, you've then got the regulatory landscape of, what kind of compliance do they want for that? So that the operations of wearable distribution can be a challenge, and the identification of a hardware that fits your target population certainly is. So I think that the opportunity is there, but it's not quite sort of where I'd like to see it be just yet in that regard. From a video point of view, it's, again, people think, I've got WhatsApp. I can just upload videos via WhatsApp, so it must be really easy. But there is, even from the data capture piece, a lot of technical operational issues to be considered. Not everybody actually has access to strong Wi-Fi, and these videos can be quite big. We adopt a bring your own device approach. So different cameras will have different capabilities, sort of the video they record. And then some countries really want the facial blurring, really understanding where the location of the server of the videos will be, how long they'll be retained for, how do you kind of segregate who has access to it. So there's sort of technical and regulatory compliance aspects to be considered, as well as then the patient experience of where they're living and how they interact with the devices.
Yeah, there's always so much, but I think unless organizations like yours actually move forward and get going with doing some of this stuff, everybody can just hide behind the complexity, right? That's been my experience of it anyway.
And I think it's a really good point that, you sort of, when I was a clinician, I would really challenge the pharmaceutical companies going, why have you designed this study design? Why is it doing this? And they're like, oh, it's the regulators. The regulators say it has to be done. And then when I was a regulator, I was saying, why are you designing this study? It's like rubbish. And they go, oh, it's the clinicians. The clinicians tell us that it's the only way it can be done. And so there's a bit of risk averse in experimenting with new aspects. And I think overall as an industry and as a sector, people are more inclined to repeat the same study design, repeat the same study approach, and still kind of be okay with getting the same failed poor outcome than they are with, let's try something completely different and, prepare that it may or may not work. And it's an interesting environment, I think, in that mindset.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think we see that all the time. What about like designing these trials? Do you actively engage with the target population? Like I guess you can ask children how you want the trial to be designed. That's probably a bit more difficult than asking an adult, right? Because the child is a child, so you might not get back necessarily the answer that you want. I don't know. I'm waffling here, but I think you get what the premise of my question is.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, but actually I think children will tell you honestly, right?
Okay.
So one of the first, we have a patient group accelerator, and we, work with patient groups, and we get children, adults, testing, giving feedback. One of the first experience I had was working with young people that were helping us design a solution to support renal transplant patients and the adherence to the medication after renal transplant. And it was sort of a medication adherence tool. And the feedback was brutal. It was like, this is, and they were so honest and upfront, and and you wouldn't get that from adults, right? And so they would kind of going, oh, well, potentially you could maybe and then it would go to practice. So I actually think children and young people are better at giving honest, useful feedback. Yeah. I think it's just us as adults that are sort of apprehensive for getting a 7-year-old telling you how you're doing something completely wrong and being able to implement that into it. But, in this instance, I think if we listen to the children earlier, then it would help on recruitment, retention, data, engagement, the whole thing.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, because what an adult might perceive as being fun, a 7-year-old might go, that's not fun at all.
Yeah. So lost it.
Yeah, exactly. What about decentralized trials? We have a lot of guests come on this show who are working in all different parts of the industry, and the topics that we get into often broach into the whole realm of decentralized trials. What are the considerations when it comes to paediatric trials and DCTs? Curious to get your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I generally feel that DCTs are better suited for paediatric. The stress that it takes for parents to take their children to hospital is unlike anything we can possibly consider, because it generally means that you have to take time off work. It generally means that you've got siblings that need carers. And then it generally means that your cost of travel and your time to travel is much higher, because you have wheelchairs, you have special equipment, you have behavioral issues that public transport may or may not be able to sort of support. And, these are the exact sort of families and children that DCTs should be supporting. And also, we've got experience from diseases such as Sanfilippo, where failed clinical trials has kind of, ended up with parents saying those sort of assessment in those sort of clinic rooms where they've taken 4 hours to travel, they're still stressed from the noise in the aeroplane, and now you want them to sit in a white room with glaring bright lights, answering questions and doing tests, is not showing you my child at their best behavior. And this is where I generally feel that the pediatric population should be having, the leading opportunity in having at-home assessments, and with the right support from the carers and the parents and the infrastructure, could benefit the most from it.
Got it. And maybe that's a good segue into giving us a bit of background about yourself, Elin Haf, and like how you got into having a really good perspective on this topic, and how you created the company as well.
Yeah, so Apartito is sort of 8 years old, but in some ways I sort of feel like it's 25 years old, because it combines 11 years of clinical nursing, 20 clinical trials supporting children flying in from countries all over Europe every month of every 3 months. And just, the repeat story of understanding how difficult it was for the child, the siblings, the parents to accommodate that of, 3 days in hospital with 18 tests and whatever else. My PhD was really trying to look at passive ways of capturing endpoints in children. And then kind of thinking, okay, well, I can't change this clinical academic level, so let's work at a regulatory level. And then 6 years working as a regulator, evaluating over 100 paediatric investigational plans. And again, seeing the same sort of challenges and thinking there's just some of these, the pieces of the jigsaw to change this seems to be missing. And that was kind of the background to founding Apartito. So on one way, I'm a bit of jack of all trades, master of none, because I had clinical, academic, regulatory sort of chapters of my career. But on another way, I think that having seen the challenges or the sort of motivation of each of these people in the different sectors has kind of helped me design Apartito in a way that can, as best as we can, support and address those needs.
Awesome. And yeah, I think that's a really fascinating background and give you great perspective into what you're doing today. And maybe you could just elaborate a bit more on some of the products and services that Apartito offer, and the technology platforms and things like that.
Yeah, so Atom 5's, I guess, our flagship product. So it's a software platform that's highly configurable, multilingual, and disease agnostic. And it can incorporate as many or as few modules as you want. So it could be e-consent, it could be telemedicine, it could be hardware wearable integration, it could be e-pros, it could be medication adherence, or it could be video-based assessment in terms of e-COAs. As I said, it's the video-based assessments that we're having a huge interest in for pediatric trials so far. So as a company approach, it's very much a platform as a service offering to support clinical trials. I guess from my own perspective, I love to work with clients early to sort of understand what it is that they are, the drug, the disease, the mechanism of action, and which endpoints they want to design or develop to capture what's important for that clinical trials. And then I guess a really other important part of the company is our patient group accelerator. So we, nominate 2 patient groups a year or every 18 months or so, and we co-create endpoints that are important to them. So starting by asking, what do you want to measure? And then looking at how do we measure that digitally in the home for that group. So a bit of a different mix there from working with sponsors to design stuff, getting the patient's input, but then developing a product that's really scalable and configurable.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And how does that, for that second part of the business that you talked about, is that a pretty substantial kind of part of what you guys do in terms of how you're differentiated with other providers out there?
I think so. A lot of our current clients sort of comment that is particularly more the smaller biotechs that don't necessarily have, huge amount of teams to be doing everything in-house, and they appreciate that mix of sort of patient voice input, regulatory consideration, and then technical design. So it's more than a tech product kind of thing. Cool.
And do you have, like, from a practical standpoint, I think you may have alluded to it earlier, it's like a BYOD type approach, so people use their own devices?
Yeah, so from a hardware of a wearable point of view, we tend to provide the wearables.
Yeah.
But the main interaction is via a smartphone, which tends to be a bring your own device. We know that patients or parents interact with their own phone on a multiple times a day. And so, we ask them to download the study specific app on their own phone and then support Android and iOS in that capacity. There are some studies that also has a web platform, so that they can interact with it on a web platform if they don't want to use the app. That's not got all the features, so would be harder with some things like wearable integration, but it is there for some of our studies as well.
And are you finding like compliance rates are pretty high with this type of approach?
Yeah, it's definitely a learning curve over the last 8 years. And I think, the example I told you about, we had a wearable device that had been selected. We rolled it out in studies of children with arthritis, Niemann-Pick, and Duchenne. And it was really interesting. The arthritis patients were like, I'm not wearing that to school. My mates will think I'm, not cool enough. And so, we quickly realized that engagement was poor for that population. Whereas the Niemann-Pick population, they really cherished it and wanted to wear it. And then the Duchenne population, they're on steroids with some autistic behavior. They couldn't cope with the fact that it wasn't symmetrical on their wrist and kind of had some skin sensitivity. So, it's a long-winded way of saying compliance was really poor in terms of those wearable expectations. We have other, medication adherence and seizure reporting studies where we've designed it in a way that we're actually sort of overall getting 97 to 99% adherence, which is really high. But that comes with kind of having played around with a lot of aspects that works for that population in terms of reminders, how long the windows are open for, and that kind of thing. So definitely lots of lessons learned of what does and doesn't support engagement. And I think overall, and, probably not surprising to you, knowing that I'm a nurse by background, engagement still requires some human interaction engagement. So knowing that you've got people engaged with your care, looking at your data, reminding you, promoting you to do it is still really important. It's not just a digital option only.
Are there like feedback loops in place with this type of technology now, where in so much as the patient or the participant in the trial can actually visualize the data that's being collected, if the protocol allows for them to do that? I appreciate sometimes it might not be allowed as part of the protocol for somebody to see the data, but I don't know. I think human beings naturally are curious, and they probably want to see, look, what are my measurements? What does it look like in the context of other people's measurements, maybe? Yeah,
it's a really good point. And I think technically, yes, the technical capabilities are there. The problem we have is when studies are double blind, or you don't want patients seeing their own data to impact their behavior. So as an example, if you're wearing a wearable and you're seeing that your number of steps are declining every day, is that going to make you think, oh no, I'm on placebo, so there's no point and I'm going to give up with this clinical trial? Or is it going to sort of make you think, oh my God, I have to work really, really harder to try and up my game? And so there are aspects in maintaining the methodological rigor of the study design that you don't get other aspects influence the data in that sort of placebo noise aspect. Having said that, I think patients understandably are exhausted from throwing all their data into a black box and never getting anything back. And I think this is a wider issue for clinical trial in general. How many patients take part in clinical trials, never even get a thank you at the end, or they don't get their personal results presented to them in the way they understand or at all, or even the study results in any other format than a academic paper that they can barely follow the title of. And so what we could be doing much better is updating them on the study, saying, hey, thank you so much. We've now recruited 50% of the patient. We've now recruited 100% of the patient. We still need you, you're 50% of way through, keep with it. I think if we just did those simple things, even that alone would be really important and really helpful for patient engagement, let alone saying, hey, you were 3 steps lower yesterday than you were day before, kind of thing, to simplify it really.
No, I agree. And again, there might be kind of considerations about what you can and can't do, but even some of the points that you suggested there about telling people how far through the study they are, how many enrolled, it creates a sense of community. So I think everybody wants to be part of something. And if you can do that in some way or another, then the knock-on effects are going to be positive in lots of different areas, I think.
Yeah. And it's sort of one of those things that, again, I think if we designed studies for children and rolled out, it's like communicating these aspects with children. It's not a complicated stuff, and yet we've still not managed to do it or do it well with these study participants, and yet something that I think generally could benefit the whole community.
Totally agree. Well, look, Elin Haf, as we draw this episode to a close, we always ask our guests the same final question. And that is, if there was one thing that you could change about our industry, what would that be?
So, not surprisingly, I guess, I just love that we could flip it completely on its head and start with everything from the need of the child and then roll it out to adults. In terms of the future of the world, in terms of the future of our health, we know that addressing healthcare issues in childhood leads to better outcomes in adults. And that could be done through research, study designs, endpoints, measurements, you name it. So my wish would be to really flip it all and start really prioritizing childhood health issues and then letting them roll onto adulthood.
Amen to that. I think I can't see anybody disagreeing with that. Now, I'm sure listeners on the show will want to get in touch and learn more about what you're up to, what Aparito is up to. Where's the best place for our listeners to connect with you?
Yeah, so our website's aparito.com. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter, Aparito Health Twitter handle. And sorry, I'm doubting myself there. We've got a Twitter handle, Aparito Health, and also just email us info@aparito.com.
Awesome. Elin Haf, thanks very much indeed. Really looking forward to publishing this episode.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.